Milan, a chill in the air and an absolute anomaly on the ice. It wasn't a crash. It wasn't a blunder. It was a silence that spoke volumes. Initially, it flew under the radar. Spectators were just getting comfortable, nylon coats rustling against arena chairs. A handful of folks were still chatting, while lenses focused and screens glowed in the dim light. Typically, a detail like this gets buried in the chaos of tournament day. But this time, a select few caught it. Down at the scorer's table, a single evaluator shifted forward. Nothing flashy. Just a slight tilt of the head to get a dead center look at the frozen stage. A second reviewer adjusted their posture, minor movements sure. But in this game, when the brass gets twitchy, history is either unfolding or loading up, and right in the middle of the rink waited Ilia Malinin. The kid lacked his usual velocity. Truth be told, he was dragging the pace, just coasting smoothly around the perimeter, steel slicing a razor-thin groove into the frozen water, one muted stride, followed by a second. Anyone who tracks his career would have snapped to attention right then and there. Blistering momentum is basically his calling card. Across the past couple of campaigns, this prodigy forged a legacy so wild, it felt like pure myth to the uninitiated. Supporters dubbed him the Quad God, zero irony involved. It was a literal job title. Back in 2022, he shattered reality, becoming the absolute first athlete ever to nail a quadruple axel on the global stage. We are talking 4.5 airborne spins, a maneuver analysts argued about for generations, yet practically nobody actually tried pulling off for the longest time. It was pure chalkboard fiction. Then he stuck the landing, and the entire ceiling of the sport shattered overnight. Therefore, when a guy famous for rocket-fueled power throttles down at the starting line, eyeballs lock in. Over by the press box, a pair of journalists had been murmuring since midday. No major alarms, just a steady hum of guesswork. Word on the street was his game plan got a massive overhaul. We are not talking minor tweaks here. We mean a foundational teardown. A veteran trainer from overseas, fresh off watching the morning warm-ups, supposedly dropped a hint out in the corridors. The guy never claimed the set looked superior, never called it inferior. Either he just labeled it foreign. At this tier of competition, that specific word is a loaded gun. Standard routines are mapped out with mathematical obsession. Mentors construct the exact blueprint, pinpointing every single takeoff to squeeze out maximum points while keeping gas in the tank. Opening leaps, middle-tier combos, delayed point boosters. It is a standard script, but the whispers bouncing off the stadium walls hinted that he ripped up the core playbook. Beyond simple dance moves, the actual framework was gutted. Then the track hit. A deep, heavy hum rolled out of the sound system, completely void of those typical grand symphonies athletes usually lean into. This beat was dragging, heavy with mood. Practically straight out of a blockbuster movie, he propelled himself outward, still staying grounded. 20 ticks faded 30. Way up in the bleachers, a fan muttered under their breath. What is he waiting for? A totally valid concern. A competitor defined by insane mechanics typically floors the gas pedal right into leap number 1. But no, he carved out a massive arc around the sheet instead, an extended hover, leaning hard into the blade, and out of nowhere, the whole building dropped into a hush. No announcer demanded silence. The crowd just instinctually sensed that an absolute wild card was being played. Down at the control desk, an adjudicator shot a fast look at the official playbook, then immediately snapped their eyes back to the action. The setup path he was burning into the frost completely contradicted the promised routine. Right then, the vibe inside the Colosseum pivoted. Not adrenaline yet, pure, unadulterated intrigue. He dug faintly into his left side, his upper body twisted, snapping into a launch stance that seasoned veterans clocked instantly. A vault was coming, except the flight path was totally off, too abbreviated, way too straight. For a fraction of a heartbeat, a bunch of experts on the board shared the exact same terrified thought. If that takeoff vector hinted at what they feared, he sure as hell was not opening the show with the standard trick. He was gearing up to throw down something alien. A stunt nobody in that zip code had ever witnessed him try. And just like that, the muted stadium did not feel peaceful. It felt like 10,000 people were suffocating on anticipation. For a fleeting second, time basically crawled to a halt, not absolute zero volume, but damn near it. The soundtrack continued bumping faintly through the public address system, a deep heartbeat echoing over the frost. But practically nobody in the stands was paying attention to the audio track. Focus had permanently pivoted. Every single eye was glued to the violent groove Ilia was carving through the frozen floor. He wrapped up the tight arc and drove onward. Still icy, still fully contained, frankly. He looked unnervingly relaxed. That specific vibe meant everything when athletes gear up for their nastiest tricks. They usually crank up obvious speed, extended runways, aggressive leg swings, momentum redlining across the board. He completely ignored all of that. Instead, his flight path stayed squeezed, cut tight, straight to the point, right by the authorities. A tech guru slowly dropped a pen onto the clipboard. Why? Because only a handful of stunts in the current meta look like that on approach. And one of them is basically a death wish. A subtle flex of the knees, elbows tucked tight to the chest, that physical coil barely registered for a millisecond, but the purists in the crowd caught the machinery at work instantly. A surgically clean load up. Next thing you know, he snapped off the ground. The launch fired so fast that half the audience only processed the trick while he was already spinning in the rafters. His frame went rigid on impact, shoulders bolted down. Legs perfectly stacked, he was already torquing into the spin the exact second steel left ice. A violent blur of motion, whipping around so fast the naked eye couldn't even process the speed. 1 revolution, 2, 3, 4. Veteran broadcasters routinely fumble the math on live television. The human brain simply requires a slow motion replay to catch up to that kind of insane velocity. The officials on the ice, however, weren't leaving anything to chance. Their eyes locked onto every microscopic detail. The launch angle, the sheer altitude, the tight tuck of his limbs mid-air. Those make or break technicalities that dictate maximum points or brutal deductions. As Malinin plummeted back to earth, his steel caught the frozen surface with a violent, echoing crack. A fine mist of shaved ice kicked up into the cold air. He stuck the touchdown, though his center of gravity wavered just a fraction. His skate drifted a hair wide before he locked it in. Yet the execution remained completely flawless. The stadium didn't explode right away. Instead, a heavy, stunned silence hung over the rink. The thousands of fans were mentally hitting rewind, all wrestling with one unspoken thought. Did that actually just happen? Then came the noise. It wasn't a sudden roar, but rather a rolling thunderclap that rippled through the bleachers as the shock finally wore off block by block. That singular opening move had just launched the routine S difficulty rating straight into the stratosphere. A brutal gamble practically nobody attempts until deep into their set. Yet Malinin threw it down in the opening 60 seconds. Crazier still was his absolute poker face. 0 fist pumps, 0 playing to the cheering audience. He didn't even take a breath. It instantly melting right back into his intricate footwork. It is a trademark trait of his. Plenty of competitors milk a massive highlight to catch their wind and let the building's energy wash over them. Not him. And tonight, that relentless pace felt entirely by design, because as he carved his way into the next phase, a terrifying realization dawned on everyone. That monster leap wasn't merely a point grab. It was a warning shot. He was completely tearing up the traditional playbook. Everyone assumed he had brought to the ice, which meant the true gauntlet of this performance was still lurking right around the corner. As the initial roar finally began to fade out, the underlying vibe in the building dramatically shifted. The volume dropped, but the intensity absolutely skyrocketed. Spectators weren't passively watching anymore. They were leaning in, furiously trying to decode a master plan that had just shattered the standard pacing of professional skating. The deviation kept rolling, gliding beneath the glaring spotlights. Ilia Malinin launched into an intricate footwork pattern, slicing diagonally from corner to corner. Laymen usually tune out during these technical strides. They completely lack the fireworks of a high-flying aerial assault, but the scorekeepers scrutinize every single twitch like hawks. Every lean, every pivot, every microscopic weight transfer matters. His steel left deep, aggressive grooves in the frozen sheet, perfectly syncing with the demanding routine. Rapid directional changes paired with sudden jolts of momentum, capped off by graceful reaches that swelled right alongside the soaring soundtrack. To the completely untrained eye, it was pure fluid motion, but hardcore analysts quickly spotted the underlying trap being set. The flow felt completely rogue. Top-tier routines almost always stick to a rigid, mathematical blueprint that die-hard fans can literally call out in their sleep. Trainers strategically map out the hardest aerials at precise timestamps to farm maximum point multipliers. It is a calculated formula, a smooth intro, a gradual crescendo, and a back-breaking physical finale. Malinin tossed that predictable script straight in the trash. The heavy artillery was making an appearance way too soon. He was stringing nightmares together in spots nobody anticipated. Over by the heavy glass, a rival Federation trainer stood, dead still, arms firmly crossed, dissecting the attack. The guy had undoubtedly watched countless hours of Malinin's tape, but this bizarre layout had him scrambling for answers. Hitting center ice, the young skatenly kicked it into high gear. 3 massive power strides, feeding into a vicious crossover. The metal bit violently into the frozen rink, echoing louder and louder as he generated breakneck velocity. That unmistakable, aggressive scrape of steel tearing up the surface that diehards absolutely live for. High up in the bowls, fans physically inched closer to the edge of their chairs. You didn't need to know the technical jargon to feel the suffocating pressure cooking in that room. His posture gave it all away, dropping his center of gravity. A telltale sign veterans spot from a mile away. He was gearing up for another explosive liftoff, and this upcoming launch was infinitely more dangerous than the opening salvo. He violently punched off the ground, twisting instantly as he locked his core into a lethal airborne spin. 1, 2, 3, 4, a truly sickening blur of raw speed. The entire stadium stopped breathing all over again. Hitting the deck, his boot dragged an inch before he wrangled it back in line, a microscopic hip shift, and boom. Locked down, flawless. The stands didn't hesitate this time. Cheers ripped through the venue immediately. The writing was officially on the wall. This wasn't merely a tough skate to beat the clock. He was building a brilliant, calculated trap, laying down puzzle pieces that formed a truly terrifying big picture. It was a deeply unsettling strategy. Instead of ramping up the heat slowly, he was front-loading an absurd amount of technical stress right off the bat. Down in the scoring pit, an official leaned over and whispered intensely to the head judge. The microphones didn't catch the audio, but the pure shock on their faces screamed volumes. Assuming their slow-motion math was accurate, Malinin had just dropped 2 of the deadliest, gravity-defying moves in the history of the sport before anyone had even settled into their seats. And there was still eternity left on the clock. Out on the frigid surface, the kid showed absolute zero signs of tapping the brakes. He banked smoothly into his next setup, triggering a cold sweat for the experts feverishly tracking his points. If he kept ramping up the stakes at this psychopathic pace, the absolute deadliest trick in his entire arsenal was still locked and loaded. And this time around, every single soul in the building knew exactly what mare he was about to unleash. You could hear a pin drop. The stadium was completely captivated. Dead silence. The arena's low hum. The rustle of paper, the shifting of bodies, had vanished completely, leaving thousands locked on a single target at center ice. Ilia Malinin was already hitting the gas. The sound hit you before the sight did. That vicious, rhythmic bite of steel tearing into frozen water as he cranked up his velocity. 3 strides, then 4. Each push devouring more ice than the last, leaving a tangled web of fresh cuts glowing under the blinding stadium floods. Down at the scoring desk, a judge leaned in tight, squinting through their lenses. The American skater was locking into a stance they all knew too well. Any scout worth their salt could read the body language, the dropped shoulder, the squared hips, the aggressive lean into the turn. He wasn't winding up for a routine trick. He was hunting for a monster. Up in the bleachers, a handful of stateside supporters started a slow, rhythmic clap, matching the heartbeat of the track. It was a quiet push of momentum, yet he held off on the launch, riding that razor-thin edge until it carved a massive arc across the entire sheet of ice. That runway mattered. You don't try to defy gravity without maxing out your setup for pure, unadulterated airtime and speed. If that precise lean signaled what the panel thought it did, Malinin was about to unleash the exact move that had single-handedly rewritten the rulebook. For decades, the quad axel was nothing but a ghost story in this sport. 4.5 violent spins in midair. Suicidal. Impossible. The consensus was that human anatomy just wasn't wired to spin that fast and survive. Until this kid shattered the ceiling back in 2022. When he stomped the very first one in global competition. He etched his name in stone. Ever since that day, anytime he drops into a remotely similar glide, the whole world holds its breath. Now, right here in Milan, the signs were flashing red. He dropped his weight. He pulled his arms tight. For a split second, he coiled up like a loaded spring. Then he exploded. The sheer altitude was staggering. He shot straight up, piercing the glare of the overhead spotlights. Ankles crossed, the blur started immediately. 1, 2, 3, 4. It spins so violently that even seasoned pros lose count. It is just a tornado. But the officials were tracking a different game than the guys in the nosebleeds. They were dissecting every frame, the launch trajectory, the mid-air axis, the exact degree of the touchdown. the granular stats that make or break a score. He slammed back down to earth. The metal ripped through the frozen topcoat like a gunshot. For a terrifying microsecond, it seemed like his momentum would wash out. He skidded, fought for grip, and locked it in. Good enough. The stadium absolutely detonated. Zero hesitation. The roar was deafening. A shockwave from thousands of fans, realizing they had just seen another superhuman feat nailed in a high-stakes crucible. But the crazy part came next. No fist pumps, no grandstanding. He didn't even look up at the screaming mob. He just kept digging in, bleeding right back into his footwork sequence, treating a history-making trick like it was a basic warm-up drill. Down at the official's desk, a terrifying reality began to dawn on them. Because his blueprint was crystal clear now. He wasn't just throwing haymakers, he was stacking the deck, keeping the heat dialed to maximum from start to finish. No time to breathe, no coasting in the middle, just a brutal, relentless assault of technical elements, which meant one thing: the absolute worst was yet to come. If he kept playing this suicidal game of chess, the final act of this performance was going to be an absolute gamble. As the music shifted into the home stretch, a heavy, suffocating vibe choked the building. This wasn't just hype anymore. It was pure anxiety. The kind of dread you feel when you know you're watching a freak of nature rewrite history. Forget a flawless score. This was a seismic shift that would permanently alter the da of the game. Down on the frozen stage, Ilia Malinin shoved off the rail and drifted into the middle. He was gasping now. You could catch it in the heavy, rhythmic heave of his chest. Par for the course, when you pack a routine with this much G-force, your muscles start screaming for mercy. Every single touchdown sends a shockwave from the steel right up through the joints and into the lower back. It breaks even the elite. Yet his motor never idled. If anything, he stomped on the gas pedal again. 3 massive, surgical pushes fired him across the frozen canvas without a single ounce of wasted energy. Top half, completely stone-cold. Bottom half, an absolute engine generating pure horsepower. It's the hallmark trait that die-hard analysts look for: total command. In the big leagues, that restraint is what separates gold from a catastrophic wipeout. The soundtrack swelled, the tempo got aggressive, and there was no hiding his next move. He laid out a massive, drawn-out carve across the sheet, leaning in way heavier than the previous runs. That was clue number 1. Clue number 2. He tucked his arms in a fraction of a second early. Down by the brass, one judge instinctively crept closer to the glass. Another snapped their eyes away from the monitor. This was the money shot. He squatted down into the launch pad and fired himself toward the rafters. You couldn't miss the elevation, going airborne with clinical precision, locking into that violent spin rate that forced the world to crown him the quad god. Turn after turn, the entire stadium forgot to breathe. Steel screamed against the frozen rink as his skate slammed down. For a split heartbeat, disaster loomed, his edge sliding dangerously off axis. But he snapped it right back. A microscopic shift in his hips locked the movement in. His trailing leg flicked into place, instantly anchoring the landing. The stands absolutely exploded. The roar deafening and electric. Down at ice level, however, the scoring panel wasn't cheering. Their eyes were locked in, calculating and razor sharp. They finally saw the blueprint of Molin's true master plan, while the rest of the pack backloaded their routines for late bonus points. This kid was executing a relentless, high-octane assault from the very first note. There was zero breathing room from his starting pose to the dying seconds. No safe zones, no traditional pacing. Just a brutal gauntlet of elite maneuvers, stitched together with punishing transitions. It was absolute warfare on the ice, yet calculated to the millimeter. Out in the spotlight, Milan let the final chord wash over him, bleeding off his momentum in one sweeping, victorious curve. That was the cue for the entire stadium to collectively exhale. Thunderous cheers shook the rafters, but the real story was written on the faces of the judges. Silent, stunned looks passed down the line. They knew they hadn't just watched someone rack up technical points. He had completely shattered the accepted playbook of the sport. That revolutionary blueprint was about to make history. Fans wouldn't be talking about a specific quad or a standalone spin. They would be dissecting the overall masterpiece. Evolution in athletics rarely relies on a single flashy trick. True genius sneaks in through the foundation, completely reinventing the way a performance breathes. And judging by the electric shockwave rolling through that crowd in Milan, the world was starting to realize they had just witnessed exactly that.